What happens when the person everyone underestimates holds the power to make or break the toughest warriors in the world? Sometimes the most dangerous people are hiding in plain sight, wearing a smile and pretending to be ordinary. This is the story of how one woman's secret identity turned a military base upside down and taught everyone a lesson they would never forget. Sarah Martinez had grown accustomed to the snickers and whispers that followed her wherever she went on Camp Pendleton. At 28, she stood barely 5 feet 4 inches tall, with a slight build that made her look more like a college student than someone who belonged on one of the most elite military bases in the country. Her long brown hair was always pulled back in a simple ponytail, and she wore the standard physical therapy uniform that somehow made her appear even smaller than she actually was. Every morning, Sarah would walk through the base with her head held high, carrying her medical bag and wearing a professional smile that never quite reached her eyes. The Marines she passed would often do double takes, some nudging their buddies and making comments just loud enough for her to hear. "Look at that little PT girl trying to act tough," Staff Sergeant Rodriguez muttered to his squad as Sarah walked past the training grounds one Tuesday morning. "Bet she's never even seen real combat." His words carried across the morning air, and Sarah's step faltered for just a moment before she continued walking. She had heard variations of this comment hundreds of times since arriving at the base 6 months ago. The assumption was always the same. She was just another soft civilian contractor who had landed a cushy job helping injured Marines stretch their sore muscles. The physical therapy clinic where Sarah worked was located in a modern building near the medical center. It was a clean, well-equipped facility with state-of-the-art equipment and large windows that let in plenty of natural light. Sarah shared the space with 3 other physical therapists, all of whom had been there much longer and seemed to have earned more respect from their military clients. Dr. James Peterson, the head of the physical therapy department, was a former Army medic who had transitioned to civilian life after serving 2 tours in Afghanistan. He was a good man who treated Sarah fairly, but even he sometimes seemed surprised by her quiet confidence and the way she handled some of the more challenging patients. "Sarah, you've got Lieutenant Morrison in room 3, Dr. Peterson called out as she arrived for her morning shift. "He's still giving everyone trouble. Refuses to do his exercises properly and keeps complaining about the pain." Lieutenant Morrison was a 25-year-old Marine who had injured his shoulder during a training exercise. He was young, cocky, and made no effort to hide his disdain for what he called playing patty cake with the physical therapy staff. When Sarah knocked on the door to room 3 and entered, Morrison was slouched in a chair, scrolling through his phone. "Great, they sent me the little one again," he said without looking up. "I told Peterson I want someone who actually knows what they're doing. No offense, but you look like you've never lifted anything heavier than a clipboard." Sarah set her notes down on the small table and began preparing the exercise equipment. She had learned long ago that responding to these comments with anger or frustration only made things worse. Instead, she maintained her professional demeanor and focused on her job. "Good morning, Lieutenant Morrison. How is your shoulder feeling today?" she asked, her voice calm and steady. "It hurts, obviously. That's why I'm here instead of training with my unit," he replied, finally putting his phone away but still making no effort to be respectful. "Look, can you just do whatever you need to do so I can get out of here? I've got real Marine stuff to do." Sarah nodded and began explaining the exercises they would be working on. As she guided Morrison through the movements, she could see him watching her with a mixture of boredom and skepticism. He performed the exercises half-heartedly, clearly not taking the session seriously. "You know what your problem is?" Morrison said as Sarah adjusted his arm position. "You've never been in the real world. You've never had to push through real pain or face real danger. This whole thing is just a game to you." For a moment, Sarah's hand stilled on Morrison's shoulder. Something flickered behind her eyes, something that might have been amusement or perhaps something far more dangerous. But the moment passed quickly, and she resumed the exercise routine. "Everyone has their own experiences with pain and challenges, Lieutenant," she said quietly. "The important thing right now is getting your shoulder back to full strength so you can return to your unit." After Morrison left, Sarah sat alone in the treatment room for a few minutes, staring out the window at the training grounds where Marines were running obstacle courses and practicing combat drills. She could see them from her position, small figures in the distance pushing themselves through grueling exercises under the hot California sun. Her phone buzzed with a text message, and she glanced down to see a message from an unknown number. Package delivery scheduled for 0800 tomorrow. Standard protocols apply. Sarah deleted the message immediately and slipped the phone back into her pocket. She had work to do. The rest of the week continued much the same way. Sarah treated her patients with professional competence and quiet dignity while enduring a constant stream of dismissive comments and condescending attitudes. Some of the Marines were polite enough, but many seemed to view her as little more than a necessary inconvenience in their recovery process. Corporal Jenkins, a tough-looking Marine with arms covered in tattoos, was particularly vocal about his opinions during his Friday afternoon session. "I don't get why they hire civilians for this stuff," he said as Sarah worked on his injured knee, "especially ones who look like they'd blow over in a strong wind. How are you supposed to understand what we go through out there?" Sarah continued her work without responding immediately. She had learned that engaging in these conversations rarely led anywhere productive. "I mean, no disrespect," Jenkins continued, though his tone suggested otherwise, "but you probably went to some fancy college and learned this stuff from textbooks. The real world is different. Combat is different. You can't understand what it's like to have someone shooting at you, or to carry a wounded buddy for miles through enemy territory." "You're right," Sarah said simply, surprising Jenkins with her agreement. Everyone's experiences are different. Jenkins seemed taken aback by her response. He had clearly expected an argument or at least some defensive reaction. Instead, Sarah just continued working on his knee with the same quiet professionalism she showed everyone. As Friday afternoon turned into evening, Sarah finished up her last patient and began cleaning her treatment room. The physical therapy clinic was quieter now, with most of the staff having gone home for the weekend. She could hear Dr. Kentek stare. Peterson in his office finishing up some paperwork before calling it a day. Sarah was putting away some equipment when she heard voices in the hallway outside her room. She recognized the voices immediately. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez and several members of his squad were walking past, discussing their weekend plans. "I still can't believe they've got that little PT girl working with Marines," Rodriguez was saying. "She looks like she'd cry if someone raised their voice at her. Probably never faced anything more dangerous than a paper cut in her whole life." The other Marines laughed, and Sarah could hear them continuing their conversation as they walked away. She stood very still for a moment, her hands gripping the piece of equipment she had been putting away. Her knuckles were white, and for just an instant her carefully maintained composure cracked slightly. But then she took a deep breath, finished putting the equipment away, and gathered her things to leave for the day. Sarah's apartment was a small, neat place about 10 minutes from the base. It was sparsely furnished but comfortable, with large windows that provided good natural light during the day. The walls were mostly bare, with just a few generic landscape prints that had come with the furnished rental. She lived alone, which suited her perfectly. Sarah valued her privacy and quiet time, especially after spending long days dealing with difficult patients and their assumptions about who she was and what she was capable of. That evening, Sarah made herself a simple dinner and sat down to eat while reviewing some patient files. She was meticulous about her work, always looking for ways to improve her treatment plans and help her patients recover more effectively. Despite the constant disrespect she faced, Sarah genuinely cared about helping the Marines get back to full strength. As she worked, her phone rang. The caller ID showed a number she recognized, and Sarah answered on the second ring. "Martinez," she said simply. "Sarah, it's Commander Stevens. I hope you're settling in well at Pendleton." Commander Stevens was Sarah's primary contact, though their relationship was one that existed completely outside the world of the physical therapy clinic. Stevens was one of the few people who knew the full truth about Sarah's background and her real reason for being at Camp Pendleton. "Everything is going according to plan," Sarah replied. "The assignment is progressing as expected. I know it can't be easy dealing with some of those attitudes, but your cover is holding perfectly. No one suspects anything." Sarah looked out her window toward the distant lights of the base. "They see exactly what we want them to see. Have you had a chance to observe the training programs? Any initial assessments?" "I'm still gathering information, but I'm starting to get a clearer picture of the current training methods and areas that might need attention. The physical conditioning is solid, but there are some gaps in mental resilience training that could be addressed." Commander Stevens was quiet for a moment. "Sarah, I want you to know that what you're doing is important. I know the cover story requires you to endure a lot of disrespect and dismissive treatment, but the information you're gathering will help us improve training programs across multiple bases.
I understand, sir.
The mission is what matters. After ending the call, Sarah set her phone aside and returned to her patient files. But her mind wasn't entirely focused on the work in front of her. She was thinking about the Marines she treated every day, about their assumptions and their casual dismissal of her capabilities. They had no idea who they were really dealing with, and sometimes Sarah wondered what their reactions would be if they knew the truth. The weekend passed quietly. Sarah used the time to maintain her physical fitness, running along quiet trails away from the base where she wouldn't encounter any of the Marines she worked with. She also spent time reading and studying, keeping up with the latest developments in both physical therapy and other areas of expertise that were more relevant to her true background. Monday morning arrived with the usual routine. Sarah arrived at the clinic, checked in with Dr. Peterson, and reviewed her schedule for the day. She had 6 patients scheduled, including Lieutenant Morrison, for a follow-up session, and a new patient who was recovering from a training injury. The new patient was Sergeant First Class Williams, a career Marine with 15 years of service. He had injured his back during a combat training exercise and was clearly frustrated about being sidelined from his duties. Williams was older than most of Sarah's patients, with graying hair and the weathered look of someone who had seen extensive combat. "So you're the new PT I've heard about," Williams said as Sarah entered his treatment room. His tone was neutral, but Sarah could sense the skepticism underlying his words. "I'll be honest with you, I don't have much patience for this rehabilitation stuff. I need to get back to my unit as quickly as possible." Sarah nodded and began reviewing his medical file. "I understand your urgency, Sergeant Williams. The goal is to get you back to full strength as safely and efficiently as possible. Rushing the process could lead to re-injury, which would keep you sidelined even longer." Williams studied her for a moment, taking in her small stature and young appearance. "No offense, but you look like you're barely out of college. Have you worked with many combat veterans?" "I have experience working with military personnel," Sarah replied truthfully, though she knew Williams would interpret that statement very differently than she meant it. Every patient is different, but the principles of rehabilitation are consistent. As they worked through the initial assessment, Williams continued to test Sarah with questions and comments designed to gauge her knowledge and experience. He was more subtle than some of her other patients, but the underlying message was the same. He doubted her competence and questioned whether she truly understood what Marines went through. "The thing about back injuries," Williams said as Sarah guided him through some gentle stretches, "is that they can be unpredictable in combat situations. You might feel fine during normal activities, but when you're carrying a full pack and running under fire, that's when you discover if you're really healed." Sarah continued working, her movements precise and confident. "That's why we focus on functional strength and mobility patterns that simulate real-world demands. The goal isn't just to eliminate pain, but to restore full operational capacity." Williams raised an eyebrow. "Operational capacity? That's interesting terminology for a civilian PT." For a split second, Sarah felt a small surge of alarm. She had slipped slightly, using language that was more common in military circles than in civilian physical therapy. But she recovered quickly, maintaining her professional demeanor. "I've worked with enough military patients to pick up some of the terminology," she said with a slight smile. "It helps to speak the same language as my patients." Williams seemed satisfied with this explanation, and they continued the session without further incident. But Sarah made a mental note to be more careful about her word choices. Maintaining her cover required constant attention to these small details. The incident with Williams reminded Sarah of just how careful she needed to be. She had been at Camp Pendleton for 6 months now, long enough to become comfortable in her role, but comfort could lead to carelessness. The success of her mission depended on maintaining the fiction that she was exactly what she appeared to be: a young, inexperienced physical therapist who had never faced real danger or challenge. That afternoon, Sarah was working in the main therapy room when she overheard a conversation between 2 Marines who were waiting for their appointments. They were discussing an upcoming training exercise that was scheduled to begin the following week. "I heard they're bringing in some new instructors for the advanced combat course," Corporal Martinez was saying. "Supposed to be some real hardcore types who are going to push us harder than we've ever been pushed before." "About time," replied Private Johnson.
"Some of the training has gotten too soft lately."
We need instructors who actually know what combat is like, not just people who've read about it in manuals. Sarah continued her work, but she was listening carefully. The Advanced Combat course was one of the programs she had been asked to evaluate, and the arrival of new instructors could be significant to her mission. "Do you know who the new instructors are?" Martinez asked. "No idea, but I heard they're bringing in some Navy SEALs to help run the program. Real-deal operators, not training command types." Sarah's hands stilled for just a moment as she processed this information. Navy SEAL instructors at Camp Pendleton could complicate things considerably. SEALs were trained to be observant and suspicious, qualities that could potentially threaten her carefully maintained cover. But she pushed these concerns aside and focused on her immediate responsibilities. She would deal with complications as they arose. For now, she needed to maintain her role and continue gathering the information that had brought her to Camp Pendleton in the first place. The rest of the day passed without incident, and Sarah finished her shift at the usual time. As she walked across the base toward the parking area, she could see Marines engaged in various training activities. Some were running obstacle courses, others were practicing combat drills, and a few were engaged in hand-to-hand combat training. She paused for a moment to watch a group of Marines practicing defensive techniques. Their instructor, a tough-looking sergeant, was demonstrating proper form and technique. The Marines were clearly working hard, but Sarah could see several areas where their technique could be improved. "Enjoying the show?" Sarah turned to find Staff Sergeant Rodriguez standing behind her, arms crossed and wearing an expression of mild amusement. "Just watching the training," she replied. "It's impressive to see how hard everyone works." Rodriguez followed her gaze toward the training area. "Yeah, these are good Marines. They know how to push themselves when it matters. That's the difference between people like us and people like—" He gestured vaguely in Sarah's direction. "People like me?" Sarah asked, her tone remaining perfectly neutral. "No offense, but you've probably never had to really push yourself. Never had to dig deep and find that extra gear when everything is on the line. It's not your fault, you just haven't had the same experiences." Sarah nodded thoughtfully. "You're probably right about that," she said, and Rodriguez seemed pleased that she wasn't arguing with his assessment. "Don't take it the wrong way," he continued. "Everyone has their role to play. Yours is helping us get patched up so we can get back to doing the real work. That's important too, in its own way." "I appreciate that perspective," Sarah replied. "I should probably get going now. Have a good evening, Staff Sergeant." As Sarah walked away, Rodriguez watched her go with a mixture of pity and condescension. Like so many others on the base, he had no idea that the small, quiet woman he had just dismissed was carrying secrets that would have shattered his assumptions about who she really was. Sarah reached her car and paused before getting in, looking back at the base one more time. In the distance, she could still see the Marines training, pushing themselves through demanding exercises under the guidance of their instructors. Soon, those instructors would be joined by Navy SEALs who would bring new challenges and new levels of intensity to the training programs. And when that happened, Sarah knew that her own challenges would be just beginning. Maintaining her cover among suspicious, highly trained special operations personnel would require every bit of her considerable skills. But she was ready for whatever came next. After all, Sarah Martinez had been preparing for missions like this, one for most of her adult life. The Marines at Camp Pendleton saw her as a weak, inexperienced civilian who couldn't possibly understand their world of combat and sacrifice. What they didn't know was that Sarah understood that world better than most of them ever would. But that was a truth she intended to keep hidden, at least for now. The success of her mission depended on it. And Sarah had never failed a mission yet. The following Monday morning brought news that spread quickly through Camp Pendleton. The Advanced Combat Training Program was beginning, and with it came the arrival of the Navy SEAL instructors that everyone had been talking about. Sarah learned about their arrival the same way everyone else did, through the base gossip network that seemed to operate faster than official communications. She was treating Corporal Jenkins when Dr. Davis's brother, however, Peterson knocked on her treatment room door. "Sarah, when you're finished with Corporal Jenkins, could you come see me in my office? We've got some new developments that might affect your schedule." 20 minutes later, Sarah sat across from Dr. Peterson in his cluttered office. Medical journals were stacked on every available surface, and his computer screen showed a complex scheduling program that he was constantly trying to keep updated. "The Navy SEAL instructors arrived this morning," Peterson began, and they've requested physical therapy support for their training program. Apparently, they're planning to push the trainees harder than usual, which means we can expect more injuries and more intensive rehabilitation needs. Sarah nodded, maintaining the appropriate level of professional interest. How many additional patients are we expecting? Hard to say exactly, but they want one of our therapists assigned specifically to support their program. Someone who can be on call and available for immediate treatment if needed. Peterson leaned back in his chair and studied Sarah for a moment. I'm thinking of assigning you to this program. You're the newest member of our team, so you have the most flexibility in your schedule. Plus, you've shown good judgment in handling some of our more challenging patients. I'd be happy to take on the assignment, Sarah replied, though she felt a small knot of tension forming in her stomach. Working directly with Navy SEAL instructors would put her in much closer contact with people who were trained to notice things that others might miss. Great. I'll let them know. You'll probably want to introduce yourself to the lead instructor this afternoon. His name is Master Chief Petty Officer Kane. I met him briefly this morning, and he seems like a no-nonsense type who won't tolerate any delays or excuses. After leaving Peterson's office, Sarah returned to her normal schedule of patients, but her mind was partially occupied with thoughts about the new assignment. Navy SEALs were among the most elite military personnel in the world, trained to operate in the most dangerous and demanding environments imaginable. Their instructors would be experienced operators who had survived multiple deployments and learned to read people and situations with deadly accuracy. Maintaining her cover around such individuals would require extreme care and constant vigilance. One slip, one moment where her true background showed through, and her entire mission could be compromised. That afternoon, Sarah made her way to the advanced training facility, where the SEAL instructors had set up their operation. The building was located in a more remote part of the base, surrounded by obstacle courses and training areas that looked significantly more challenging than the standard Marine training facilities. The first thing Sarah noticed as she approached the building was the sound of intense physical activity coming from inside. She could hear shouted commands, the rhythm of running feet, and the occasional grunt of extreme physical exertion. Whatever was happening in there, it was clearly pushing people to their limits. Sarah entered through the main door and was immediately struck by the atmosphere of controlled intensity that filled the space. The building had been converted into a comprehensive training facility with various stations for different types of exercises. Marines were scattered throughout the space, sweating profusely as they worked through demanding routines under the watchful eyes of their new instructors. You must be the physical therapist Peterson sent over. Sarah turned to find herself facing a man who could only be Master Chief Petty Officer Kane. He was tall and powerfully built, with short gray hair and eyes that seemed to take in everything around him with methodical precision. There were scars visible on his arms and hands, the kind that came from years of dangerous work in hostile environments. Yes, sir. I'm Sarah Martinez. Dr. Peterson asked me to introduce myself and discuss how I can support your training program. Kane studied her with the same intensity she had seen him directing toward the training Marines. His gaze took in her small stature, her professional appearance, and something else that Sarah couldn't quite identify. It was the look of someone who was accustomed to evaluating people quickly and accurately. I'll be honest with you, Martinez. This isn't going to be like the regular physical therapy you're used to doing. These Marines are going to be pushed beyond normal limits, and when they get injured, they're going to need treatment that gets them back in action as quickly as possible. I understand, Master Chief. I'm prepared to adjust my treatment protocols to meet the demands of your program. Wide Tab said that Dam had to dive for second seniors in the city. We'll see. Why don't you observe for a while so you can get a sense of what we're doing here? For the next hour, Sarah watched as the SEAL instructors put the Marine trainees through a series of exercises that were unlike anything she had seen during her time at Camp Pendleton. These weren't just physical challenges. They were designed to test mental resilience, decision-making under pressure, and the ability to continue functioning when exhausted and stressed. One exercise involved Marines carrying heavy loads while navigating obstacle courses that included crawling through mud, climbing over walls, and traversing rope bridges. But the physical challenges were just the beginning. While they struggled through these obstacles, the instructors subjected them to psychological pressure, shouting contradictory commands, creating time pressure, and introducing unexpected complications. Sarah watched as several Marines reached their breaking point and collapsed from exhaustion. Others pushed through despite obvious pain and fatigue, demonstrating the kind of mental toughness that separated elite warriors from ordinary soldiers. Impressive, isn't it? Sarah turned to find another SEAL instructor standing beside her. He was younger than Kane, probably in his early 30s, with the lean, athletic build of someone who maintained peak physical condition. His name tag read Instructor Davis. "It's definitely more intensive than standard training," Sarah replied carefully. Davis chuckled. "That's one way to put it. These Marines think they're tough because they've made it through basic training and infantry school. But that's just the beginning. Real combat requires a different level of mental and physical toughness." As they talked, Sarah noticed that Davis was studying her with the same evaluating gaze she had received from Kane. It was clear that these SEAL instructors were accustomed to sizing up everyone they encountered, looking for strengths, weaknesses, and potential threats. "Have you worked with special operations personnel before?" Davis asked. "Some, but most of my experience has been with conventional military units," Sarah replied, staying as close to the truth as possible while maintaining her cover story. "It's a different world. The standards are higher, the expectations are greater, and there's no room for weakness or hesitation. I hope you're prepared for that," Sarah nodded. "I'm here to do whatever is needed to support the mission." Davis seemed satisfied with this response, and they continued watching the training in comfortable silence. But Sarah was acutely aware that every interaction with these SEAL instructors was a test of her ability to maintain her cover. They were trained to spot deception and inconsistencies, and she would need to be extremely careful not to give them any reason to become suspicious. Over the next few days, Sarah began integrating into the advanced training program. She set up a treatment station within the training facility and made herself available for immediate response to injuries. The pace was indeed more demanding than her regular clinic work, with Marines requiring treatment for everything from minor sprains to more serious injuries that resulted from the intensive training regimen. But it wasn't just the increased workload that made the assignment challenging. Working in close proximity to the SEAL instructors meant that Sarah was under constant observation by people who were trained to notice details that others would miss. Master Chief Kane, in particular, seemed to watch her with special attention. Sarah could feel his eyes on her as she worked, evaluating her techniques, her interactions with patients, and her overall demeanor. She couldn't tell if his scrutiny was routine professional assessment or if he had noticed something that made him suspicious. The breaking point came on Thursday afternoon during one of the most demanding training sessions Sarah had yet witnessed. The Marines were being put through a combination of physical and psychological challenges that pushed several of them beyond their limits. Sarah was treating a Marine who had twisted his ankle during an obstacle course run when she heard a commotion from across the training floor. A Marine named Private Collins had collapsed during a particularly grueling exercise. He wasn't just exhausted, something was seriously wrong. Sarah could see from across the room that Collins was showing signs of heat stroke, a potentially life-threatening condition that required immediate medical intervention. Without thinking, Sarah abandoned her current patient and moved quickly toward Collins. Her movement was swift and purposeful, covering the distance with an efficiency that came from years of training in emergency response situations. "Move back. Give him space," she said as she knelt beside Collins, her voice carrying a tone of command that was very different from her usual gentle bedside manner. Her hands moved over Collins with practiced efficiency, checking his pulse, assessing his breathing, and evaluating his level of consciousness. "Someone call for medical evacuation," she said, her training taking over completely. "He's showing signs of severe heat exhaustion and possibly heat stroke. We need to cool him down immediately and get him to the medical facility." Sarah began implementing emergency cooling procedures, using techniques that were more advanced than what most physical therapists would know. She worked with focused intensity, her movements precise and confident as she fought to stabilize Collins's condition. It was only when the medical team arrived and took over Collins's care that Sarah realized she had attracted the attention of everyone in the training facility. Master Chief Kane was standing directly behind her, and his expression was one of intense interest rather than the casual observation she had grown accustomed to. "That was impressive work, Martinez," Kane said as Sarah stood up and stepped back to give the medical team room to work. "Where did you learn emergency response techniques like that?" Then Sarah felt a moment of panic as she realized how completely she had dropped her cover during the emergency. Her response to Collins's collapse had been instinctive and professional, but it had also revealed training and experience that went far beyond what a civilian physical therapist should possess. I took some advanced first aid courses during my training, she said, trying to keep her voice steady. I thought it would be useful given that I work with active-duty military personnel. Kane nodded, but his eyes remained fixed on Sarah with an intensity that made her uncomfortable. Those were some pretty advanced techniques for a first aid course. You handled that situation like someone with significant emergency medical experience. I've always been interested in emergency medicine, Sarah replied, sticking to her cover story while trying to project the appropriate level of modesty. I figured it was better to be overprepared than underprepared. The medical team loaded Collins onto a stretcher and prepared to transport him to the base hospital. As they worked, Kane continued his conversation with Sarah, but she could sense that the dynamic between them had shifted significantly. Collins is going to be fine thanks to your quick response, Kane said, but I'm curious about something. When you moved to help him, you didn't hesitate at all. Most people, even medical professionals, take a moment to process what they're seeing and decide how to respond. You moved immediately, like you'd been in similar situations before. Sarah could feel sweat forming on the back of her neck despite the air conditioning in the training facility. Kane's observation was accurate. Her response had been immediate and instinctive because she had indeed been in similar situations many times before, but admitting that would raise questions she couldn't answer without compromising her mission. I guess adrenaline kicked in, she said with what she hoped was a convincing smile. When you see someone in distress, training takes over and you just react. Kane didn't respond immediately, and the silence stretched uncomfortably long. Sarah could see other SEAL instructors watching their conversation with interest, and she realized that her handling of the Collins incident had marked a turning point in how these elite operators viewed her. Tell me something, Martinez, Kane said finally. What made you decide to become a physical therapist? It seems like you might have the aptitude for more advanced medical work. Sarah's real background had nothing to do with physical therapy, and the deeper Kane dug into her supposed motivations and qualifications, the more likely he was to uncover inconsistencies in her cover story. I've always been interested in helping people recover from injuries, she said carefully. Physical therapy seemed like a good way to make a real difference in people's lives while working in a medical field that wasn't too demanding. Kane raised an eyebrow at this last comment. Not too demanding? I would have thought working with injured Marines would be quite demanding, both physically and emotionally. Comment about not wanting work, that was too demanding, was inconsistent with someone who had volunteered to work with military personnel and had just demonstrated advanced emergency medical skills. What I meant was that I wanted to focus on rehabilitation rather than emergency medicine or surgery, she said, trying to recover from her error. I prefer working with patients over longer periods of time, helping them get back to full strength. Kane seemed to accept this explanation, but Sarah could tell that he was filing away every inconsistency and unusual response for future consideration. Navy SEALs were trained to be suspicious of anything that didn't fit expected patterns, and her behavior during the Collins incident had definitely raised red flags. The rest of the afternoon passed without major incident, but Sarah was acutely aware that the dynamic in the training facility had changed. The SEAL instructors were watching her more closely now, and their casual conversations often seemed to steer toward topics that would reveal more information about her background and experience. Instructor Davis approached her near the end of the day as she was packing up her equipment. That was some pretty impressive work with Collins earlier, he said. Kane mentioned that you seemed to have some advanced medical training. Where did you say you went to school? Sarah had prepared cover stories for these kinds of questions, but she knew that military personnel, especially special operations types, had ways of verifying information if they became sufficiently suspicious. I did my physical therapy training at San Diego State, she replied. Which was true as far as it went. What she didn't mention was that she had also attended several other institutions for very different types of training. I supplemented that with some additional emergency medicine courses through the Red Cross and other organizations. Davis nodded, but Sarah could tell he was making mental notes of her responses. That's good preparation. We need people who can handle themselves when things go wrong. I'm here to help however I can, Sarah said, maintaining her professional demeanor despite her growing anxiety about the increased scrutiny. That evening, Sarah returned to her apartment feeling more stressed than she had since arriving at Camp Pendleton. The Collins incident had blown her cover in ways she hadn't anticipated, revealing skills and training that raised questions she couldn't answer honestly without compromising her mission. She made herself dinner and sat down to think through her options. She could request reassignment back to the regular physical therapy clinic, but that would look suspicious given that she had volunteered for the Special Operations Support role. She could try to downplay her skills and avoid situations where her training might show through, but that would make her less effective in her real mission of evaluating the training programs. Or she could continue as she was, carefully managing her responses and hoping that the SEAL instructor's suspicions wouldn't develop into active investigation of her background. Her secure phone rang, interrupting her thoughts. It was Commander Stevens. "Sarah, I heard about the incident today. Are you all right?" "Yes, sir. A trainee had heat stroke and I provided emergency treatment. He's going to be fine." "That's not what I'm worried about. I'm told you demonstrated medical skills that were beyond what your cover story would account for." Sarah sighed. She should have known that Stevens would hear about the incident quickly. The military intelligence community was small and well-connected, especially when it came to monitoring personnel on sensitive assignments. The situation required immediate action. I couldn't let someone suffer a potentially fatal medical emergency just to maintain my cover. Of course not. You did the right thing from a medical standpoint. But we need to discuss how this affects your mission going forward. Stevens was quiet for a moment, and Sarah could hear him considering the implications of the day's events. The SEAL instructors are trained to notice inconsistencies and anomalies. If they become suspicious enough to start actively investigating your background, we could have a serious problem. I understand, sir. What are your recommendations? For now, continue the mission as planned, but be extra careful about revealing capabilities that don't fit your cover identity. And Sarah, if things get too complicated or if you feel that your cover is in serious jeopardy, let me know immediately. The mission is important, but it's not worth compromising your safety or security. After ending the call, Sarah sat in her quiet apartment and considered the challenges that lay ahead. The Collins incident had been a wake-up call about just how difficult it was to maintain a false identity while still being effective in her real role. The Navy SEAL instructors at Camp Pendleton were now watching her with the trained eyes of professionals who suspected that there was more to Sarah Martinez than met the eye. Every interaction, every response, every demonstration of skill or knowledge would be evaluated against their expectations of what a civilian physical therapist should be capable of. Sarah had been in difficult situations before, but this was different. She wasn't operating in a foreign country where she could disappear if things went wrong. She was trapped in her cover identity, surrounded by people who were growing increasingly suspicious of who she really was. But Sarah Martinez hadn't survived multiple dangerous missions by backing down when things got complicated. If the SEAL instructors wanted to test her, she would give them exactly what they expected to see: a competent but unremarkable physical therapist who was trying her best to support their training mission. What they wouldn't see, at least not yet, was the highly trained operator who had been sent to Camp Pendleton to evaluate their programs and identify areas for improvement. That secret would remain hidden, no matter how suspicious Master Chief Kane and his team became. The real test was just beginning. The tension in the advanced training facility had been building for 2 weeks since the Collins incident. Sarah could feel the weight of constant observation from Master Chief Kane and his team of SEAL instructors. Every movement she made, every word she spoke, was being analyzed and evaluated by people who were trained to detect deception and uncover secrets. Despite the pressure, Sarah maintained her professional routine. She arrived each morning at precisely 0700 hours, set up her treatment station, and made herself available for whatever injuries or medical needs arose during the intensive training sessions. She treated sprains, muscle strains, minor cuts, and the occasional more serious injury with the same quiet competence she had always shown. But Kane was watching. Always watching. It was a Tuesday morning when things finally came to a head. Sarah was treating Sergeant Williams, whose back injury had flared up again during a particularly demanding obstacle course run, when Kane approached her treatment area. "Martinez, when you're finished with Sergeant Williams, I need to speak with you privately." The tone of Kane's voice made Sarah's stomach tighten with apprehension. This wasn't a casual request or a routine check-in. Something had changed, and she suspected that whatever Kane wanted to discuss would challenge her ability to maintain her cover story. 20 minutes later, Sarah found herself in Kane's temporary office, a small room that had been converted from a storage closet. The space was spartanly furnished with just a desk, 2 chairs, and a filing cabinet. Kane closed the door behind them and gestured for Sarah to take a seat. "I've been thinking a lot about you, Martinez," Kane began, settling into his chair and fixing her with his penetrating stare. "There are some things about you that don't quite add up." Sarah maintained her composure, though her pulse quickened slightly. "I'm not sure what you mean, Master Chief. Let's start with your response to the Collins situation. You moved like someone with extensive emergency medical training. Not just first aid courses, but real professional-level experience. Your assessment was immediate and accurate, your treatment was textbook perfect, and you showed no hesitation or uncertainty." Kane leaned forward slightly, his eyes never leaving Sarah's face. "I've worked with a lot of medical personnel over the years, Martinez. Doctors, medics, corpsmen, even some civilian emergency responders. You handled that situation better than most of them would have." Sarah knew she needed to respond carefully. Too much denial would seem suspicious, but admitting to capabilities beyond her cover story could be disastrous. "I appreciate the compliment, Master Chief, but I think you're giving me more credit than I deserve. The situation with Collins was straightforward once I recognized the symptoms of heat exhaustion." Kane shook his head. "No, it was more than that. You didn't just recognize the symptoms. You implemented a treatment protocol that showed advanced understanding of emergency medicine. Where did you really learn those skills?" Kane wasn't going to be satisfied with vague references to first aid courses and civilian medical training. He wanted specific answers, and she couldn't provide them without compromising her mission. "I told you before I took additional courses in emergency medicine. I've always been interested in trauma treatment and critical care." Kane was quiet for a long moment, studying Sarah's face for any signs of deception or uncertainty. When he spoke again, his voice carried a different quality, less interrogational and more speculative. "You know what I think, Martinez? I think you're former military. I think you've had medical training that goes way beyond civilian physical therapy, and I think there's a reason you're really here that has nothing to do with treating injured Marines." Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. Kane's suspicions were far more accurate than she had hoped, and she realized that her carefully constructed cover story was beginning to crumble under the scrutiny of someone who had spent years learning to see through deception. "Master Chief, I can assure you that I'm exactly who I claim to be. I'm a civilian physical therapist who was assigned to support your training program." Kane leaned back in his chair, but his eyes remained fixed on Sarah. "Maybe. Or maybe you're something else entirely." "Ha ha 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 ha. Tell me, Martinez, what do you really think of our training program?" The question caught Sarah off guard. She had expected Kane to continue pressing her about her background and qualifications, not shift to asking for her professional assessment of the SEAL training methods. "I think it's very effective," she replied carefully. "The physical and psychological challenges are clearly designed to push trainees beyond their normal limits and develop the kind of mental toughness required for special operations." "That's a pretty sophisticated analysis for someone who's supposed to be focused on treating injuries," Kane observed. "Most medical personnel would comment on the injury rate or the physical demands. You're talking about psychological preparation and operational requirements." Sarah realized she had made another error. Her assessment of the training program had revealed knowledge and perspective that didn't fit her cover identity as a civilian physical therapist. Kane was systematically identifying every inconsistency in her behavior and building a case that she was not who she claimed to be. "I've learned a lot by observing the program over the past few weeks," she said, trying to recover. "It's natural to develop some understanding of the training objectives when you're working closely with the instructors and trainees." Kane nodded slowly, but Sarah could see that he wasn't convinced by her explanation. He was building toward something, some revelation or confrontation that would force her to either abandon her cover story or find a way to explain the inconsistencies he had identified. "Martinez, I'm going to share something with you, and I want you to listen very carefully. In my 26 years as a Navy SEAL, I've worked with intelligence operatives, military advisors, and various other personnel who weren't exactly what they seemed to be on the surface." Sarah's blood ran cold. Kane was describing exactly what she was, an intelligence operative operating undercover to gather information about military training programs. "I've learned to recognize the signs," Kane continued. The way someone moves, the way they assess situations, the way they respond to unexpected challenges. You show all the signs of someone with advanced military training, Martinez. The question is whether you're going to continue pretending to be something you're not, or whether you're going to tell me who you really are. The moment of truth had arrived. Sarah had two choices: maintain her cover story and hope that Kane's suspicions wouldn't lead to active investigation of her background, or find a way to partially reveal the truth without completely compromising her mission. Master Chief, I understand your concerns, but I can assure you that I'm here for exactly the reasons I've stated. I'm a physical therapist assigned to support your training program. This is... Kane stood up and walked to the small window in his office, looking out at the training grounds where Marines were struggling through various exercises under the watchful eyes of SEAL instructors. You know what's interesting, Martinez? Yesterday I made some calls to verify your background. San Diego State University confirmed that you graduated from their physical therapy program. Just like you said, your employment history checks out, your references are solid, and on paper, you're exactly what you claim to be. Sarah felt a moment of relief. Her cover identity had been carefully constructed to withstand exactly this kind of verification. But here's the thing, Kane continued, turning back to face her. Paper doesn't lie, but it doesn't tell the whole story either. Someone with your skills and capabilities didn't develop them in a civilian physical therapy program, no matter how good that program might have been. Kane returned to his seat and leaned forward, his expression more curious than accusatory. So, I'm going to ask you one more time, and I want a straight answer. Who are you really, and what are you really doing here? Sarah took a deep breath. She was trapped between the need to maintain her cover and the growing impossibility of explaining away Kane's observations. But she had been in impossible situations before, and she had learned that sometimes the best way forward was a careful mixture of truth and misdirection. Master Chief, you're right that I have more training than my official background would suggest, but I can't discuss the details without authorization from people above my pay grade. Kane's eyebrows rose slightly. This was the first time Sarah had acknowledged that there might be more to her story than her cover identity suggested. What kind of authorization are we talking about? The kind that comes from commanders who outrank both of us. Sarah replied, maintaining eye contact with Kane despite the risk she was taking by partially revealing the truth. Kane leaned back in his chair, processing this new information. Sarah could see him weighing the implications of her admission and trying to decide how to proceed. Are you saying you're here on orders from someone other than Dr. Peterson and the medical staff? Sarah hesitated. She was walking a very fine line between revealing enough truth to satisfy Kane's suspicions and maintaining enough operational security to protect her mission. I'm saying that my assignment here serves multiple purposes, and not all of those purposes are related to physical therapy. Kane was quiet for a long moment, studying Sarah with renewed interest. When he spoke again, his voice carried a different tone, less suspicious and more professionally curious. Are you here to evaluate our training program? The question hit so close to the truth that Sarah had to work to keep her expression neutral. Kane's military experience and intuition had led him to a conclusion that was remarkably accurate. I can't discuss the specific details of my assignment without proper authorization. Kane nodded slowly. But you're not denying it. I'm not confirming it either. For the first time since the conversation began, Kane smiled slightly. Fair enough. But Martinez, or whoever you really are, I want you to know that if you're here to evaluate what we're doing, you're seeing one of the best training programs in the military. My instructors and I take pride in preparing Marines for the realities of special operations work. Sarah realized that Kane had made a decision about how to handle his suspicions about her identity. Rather than pursuing a confrontational approach or reporting his concerns to his superiors, he was choosing to work with her within the constraints of whatever operational security requirements governed her assignment. I can see the quality of the program, Master Chief. The training is clearly effective at developing the skills and mental toughness that special operations personnel need. Kane stood up, indicating that their conversation was coming to an end. I'm glad to hear that. And Martinez, I want you to know that despite my questions about your background, I respect the work you're doing here. Whether you're treating injured Marines or serving in some other capacity, you're contributing to an important mission. Sarah stood as well, feeling a mixture of relief and continued tension. Kane's suspicions hadn't been eliminated, but he had chosen to accept the partial explanation she had provided, rather than pushing for complete revelation of her true identity and mission. "Thank you, Master Chief. I appreciate your understanding." Kane walked to the door and opened it for her. "Just remember, Martinez, if you need anything or if your real assignment requires resources or cooperation that I can provide, let me know. We're all on the same team here." As Sarah walked back to her treatment station, she reflected on the conversation with Kane. He had come closer to uncovering her true identity than anyone since she had arrived at Camp Pendleton. But rather than exposing her or demanding complete honesty, he had chosen to work within the constraints of operational security and accept her partial explanation. The conversation had changed things between them, but perhaps not in the way Sarah had expected. Kane now knew that she was more than she appeared to be, but he was choosing to support her mission rather than obstruct it. This could actually make her work easier, as she would no longer have to worry quite as much about hiding her capabilities and knowledge from at least one of the SEAL instructors. Over the next few days, Sarah noticed subtle changes in how Kane and his team treated her. They were still professional and respectful, but there was a new quality to their interactions, a recognition that she was a fellow professional rather than simply a civilian contractor. Instructor Davis approached her one afternoon as she was treating a Marine who had injured his wrist during hand-to-hand combat training. "Kane mentioned that you have some additional training beyond physical therapy," Davis said quietly. "If that includes tactical medicine or combat casualty care, we could use your input on some of our medical training protocols." This was exactly the kind of opportunity Sarah had been hoping for. Access to the detailed training protocols would allow her to complete her evaluation of the program and provide the comprehensive assessment that Commander Stevens was expecting. "I'd be happy to review your protocols and provide any input that might be helpful," she replied. Davis smiled. "Great. I'll put together some materials for you to look at. Kane thinks you might have some valuable perspectives on how we can improve our medical training." That evening, Sarah called Commander Stevens from her apartment to update him on the developments with Master Chief Kane and the SEAL instructors. "So Kane suspects you're not just a physical therapist, but he's choosing to work with you rather than expose you?" Stevens asked after Sarah had explained the situation. "That's correct, sir. He seems to have concluded that I'm here on some kind of evaluation mission, and he's supportive of that rather than threatened by it." Stevens was quiet for a moment, considering the implications. "This could actually work in our favor. If Kane is willing to provide you with access to their detailed training protocols, you'll be able to complete a much more thorough assessment than we originally planned." "That's what I was thinking, sir. The risk of exposure is still there, but Kane seems committed to operational security. He's not asking questions that I can't answer, and he's providing support for what he assumes my mission to be. Good. Continue as you are, but remain cautious. Kane may be supportive now, but if he becomes convinced that you're not who you claim to be, that could change quickly." The following week brought new challenges and opportunities. True to his word, Instructor Davis provided Sarah with detailed materials about the SEAL training program, including medical protocols, psychological preparation methods, and assessment criteria for trainee performance. Sarah reviewed the materials carefully, using her real background and training to evaluate the effectiveness of the program components. She identified several areas where improvements could be made, particularly in the integration of medical training with tactical skills and the development of decision-making capabilities under extreme stress. Her evaluation work was interrupted on Wednesday afternoon by a medical emergency that would test both her cover identity and her relationship with the SEAL instructors. During an advanced combat exercise, a trainee named Corporal Martinez had been seriously injured when a rappelling anchor failed during a building assault simulation. The corporal had fallen approximately 15 feet and was showing signs of possible spinal injury, along with obvious trauma to his left leg. Sarah was the first medically trained person to reach Martinez, and she immediately began implementing emergency medical protocols while calling for advanced medical support. But this situation was more complex than the Collins heatstroke incident. Martinez's injuries were serious enough that any mistake in treatment could result in permanent disability or death. Working under the watchful eyes of Kane and the other SEAL instructors, Sarah demonstrated medical skills that went far beyond anything a civilian physical therapist should possess. She stabilized Martinez's spine, assessed for internal injuries, managed his airway, and coordinated with the incoming medical evacuation team with the efficiency and expertise of someone with extensive combat medical experience. When the medical team finally arrived and took over Martinez's care, Kane approached Sarah with an expression of professional respect rather than suspicion. "That was outstanding work, Martinez. You may have saved that Marine's life." Sarah looked at Kane directly, realizing that the medical emergency had finally revealed the full extent of her capabilities. There was no longer any point in pretending to be just a physical therapist with some additional first aid training. "Master Chief, I think it's time we had another conversation about my background and what I'm really doing here." Kane nodded. "I think you're right, but not here. Too many ears." That evening, Kane and Sarah met at a small coffee shop off base, away from the possibility of being overheard by other personnel. The location was Kane's choice, and Sarah recognized it as the kind of place someone would choose for a sensitive conversation that needed to remain private. "All right, Martinez, or whoever you really are, I think it's time for some honest conversation. That medical work you did today wasn't just advanced first aid. That was battlefield medicine at the level of a trained special operations medic." Sarah had made her decision during the medical emergency with Corporal Martinez. Maintaining her cover was no longer possible, and Kane had proven himself to be trustworthy and supportive of her mission, even without knowing exactly what that mission was. "My name really is Sarah Martinez, and I really am a qualified physical therapist. But you're right that I have additional training and experience that goes beyond civilian medical practice." Kane leaned forward slightly. "What kind of additional training?" "The kind that comes from multiple deployments with special operations units in Iraq and Afghanistan. I'm a former Navy hospital corpsman who specialized in tactical medicine and served with both Marine Force Recon and Navy SEAL teams." Kane's eyes widened slightly. This revelation explained everything he had observed about Sarah's capabilities and behavior. A former special operations medic would indeed have the skills, training, and experience that Sarah had demonstrated. "How long did you serve?" 8 years active duty, with 6 deployments. "I left the Navy 2 years ago and completed physical therapy school as part of my transition to civilian life." Kane nodded slowly, processing this information. "And what are you really doing at Camp Pendleton?" Sarah took a breath before answering. She was about to reveal classified information to someone who didn't have official need to know, but her mission required Kane's cooperation, and she had concluded that he could be trusted. "I'm here on a classified assignment to evaluate special operations training programs and identify areas for improvement. My cover as a physical therapist allows me to observe training methods and interact with both instructors and trainees without raising suspicions." Kane was quiet for a long moment, considering the implications of Sarah's revelation. When he spoke again, his voice carried a tone of professional respect. "That makes sense. Someone with your background would be uniquely qualified to assess the effectiveness of our training methods from both a medical and tactical perspective." "Exactly. My mission is to provide a comprehensive evaluation of the program, including recommendations for improvements in areas like medical training integration, stress inoculation, and trainee selection criteria." Kane extended his hand across the table. "Well then, Sarah Martinez, let me officially welcome you to the team. If you're here to help us improve our training program, then you've got my full support." Sarah shook Kane's hand, feeling a sense of relief that she hadn't experienced since arriving at Camp Pendleton. For the first time in months, she could be honest about who she was and what she was doing, at least with one person. "Thank you, Master Chief. I appreciate your understanding and support." Kane smiled. "Don't thank me yet. Now that I know what you're really doing here, I'm going to put you to work. We've got some training scenarios coming up that could benefit from your tactical medical expertise, and I'd like your input on some modifications we're considering to our selection and assessment process." Over the next 2 weeks, Sarah worked openly with Kane and his team to evaluate and improve various aspects of the training program. Her dual perspective as both a medical professional and a former special operations operator provided insights that none of the SEAL instructors could have developed on their own. She identified ways to better integrate medical training with tactical skills, developed new assessment criteria for evaluating trainee performance under stress, and provided recommendations for improving the psychological preparation components of the program. The transformation in how the SEAL instructors treated her was remarkable. Instead of viewing her as a civilian contractor who didn't understand their world, they now recognized her as a fellow professional who had faced the same dangers and challenges they had experienced during their own careers. But Sarah's mission at Camp Pendleton was far from over. While Kane and his immediate team now knew her true identity, she still needed to maintain her cover with the broader Marine population at the base. This created new challenges as she tried to balance her open collaboration with the SEAL instructors against the need to continue appearing to be just a physical therapist to everyone else. The delicate balance was tested when Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, the Marine who had consistently dismissed and underestimated Sarah since her arrival, witnessed her providing tactical medical training to a group of SEAL instructor candidates. Rodriguez had been walking past the advanced training facility when he heard Sarah explaining advanced trauma treatment techniques to a group of experienced special operations personnel who were hanging on her every word and treating her with obvious professional respect. "What the hell is going on here?" Rodriguez demanded, entering the training room uninvited. "Since when does our little PT girl give medical training to Navy SEALs?" The room fell silent. Kane and his instructors looked to Sarah, waiting to see how she would handle this confrontation. Sarah realized that Rodriguez's intrusion represented a potential threat to her mission security, but it also presented an opportunity to finally address the months of disrespect and condescension she had endured. "Staff Sergeant Rodriguez," Sarah said calmly, "Master Chief Kane asked me to provide some input on tactical medical procedures based on my background and experience." Rodriguez laughed, but there was uncertainty in his voice. "What background? What experience?" "You're a physical therapist who treats sore muscles and twisted ankles." Kane stepped forward, his expression stern. "Staff Sergeant, you're out of line and you're interrupting a training session." But Sarah held up a hand, indicating that she wanted to handle the situation herself. She had been waiting months for an opportunity to confront Rodriguez and his dismissive attitude, and she wasn't going to let Kane fight this battle for her. "Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, you've made a lot of assumptions about me since I arrived at this base. You've dismissed me as weak, inexperienced, and incapable of understanding what Marines go through. You've been wrong about every single one of those assumptions." Rodriguez's expression shifted from amusement to confusion as he took in the scene around him. Navy SEAL instructors treating Sarah with obvious professional respect, advanced medical equipment set up for tactical training, and a confidence in Sarah's demeanor that he had never seen before. "I don't understand what's happening here," Rodriguez said, his earlier bravado fading as he realized that the dynamic was not what he had expected. Sarah made a decision. Rodriguez's intrusion had forced a confrontation that could compromise her mission security, but continuing to hide her true capabilities from him would be impossible given what he had just witnessed. "What's happening here, Staff Sergeant, is that you're finally seeing who I really am instead of who you assumed I was." Sarah walked to a whiteboard and began drawing a diagram of human anatomy, but not the kind that would be found in a physical therapy textbook. This was a tactical medicine diagram showing trauma treatment priorities, battlefield triage procedures, and advanced life-saving techniques. "For the past 8 months, you and many others on this base have treated me like I was some weak civilian who couldn't possibly understand military life or combat operations. You assumed that because I'm small and quiet, I must be soft and inexperienced." Rodriguez watched in growing amazement as Sarah's diagram became increasingly complex and detailed, showing knowledge that was clearly far beyond civilian medical training. "The truth is, Staff Sergeant, I spent 8 years as a Navy hospital corpsman serving with special operations units. I've been in more combat situations than most of the Marines on this base. I've treated battlefield injuries under fire, I've carried wounded teammates to safety, and I've made life-and-death medical decisions in some of the most dangerous places on Earth." The room was completely silent now. Rodriguez's earlier confidence had evaporated entirely as he tried to process this revelation about someone he had consistently underestimated and dismissed. Sarah continued her explanation, her voice remaining calm but carrying an authority that Rodriguez had never heard from her before. "I'm not here just to treat injuries, Staff Sergeant. I'm here on a classified mission to evaluate and improve special operations training programs. Master Chief Kane and his team are working with me because they recognize my qualifications and experience. They treat me with respect because I've earned it through years of service in some of the most demanding military roles." Rodriguez looked around the room at the Navy SEAL instructors, all of whom were nodding in confirmation of Sarah's statements. These were among the most elite military personnel in the world, and they were clearly treating Sarah as an equal and a respected colleague. I had no idea," Rodriguez stammered. "Your cover story, the physical therapy work, was exactly what it was supposed to be. a cover that allowed me to operate on this base without attracting attention while I completed my real mission. Kane stepped forward, his expression stern as he addressed Rodriguez. Staff Sergeant, what you've witnessed here is classified information that could compromise an ongoing military intelligence operation. I need your word that nothing you've seen or heard in this room will be discussed with anyone else on this base. Rodriguez nodded quickly, still processing the dramatic reversal in his understanding of who Sarah really was. Yes, Master Chief. I understand. This stays between us. Kane looked to Sarah, giving her the opportunity to add anything else she felt was necessary. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, I want you to understand something. For months, you and others have made comments about my lack of experience with real danger and combat. You assumed that because I look young and small, I must be weak and sheltered. Those assumptions were not just wrong, they were completely backwards. And Sarah walked closer to Rodriguez, and for the first time, he could see something in her eyes that he had missed during all their previous interactions. It was the look of someone who had faced real danger and survived real combat, the same look he saw in the eyes of Marines who had returned from combat deployments. I didn't correct those assumptions because maintaining my cover required letting people see what they expected to see. But understand this. I've probably seen more combat and faced more real danger than most of the people on this base, including you. Rodriguez nodded slowly, his entire perception of Sarah completely transformed by what he had learned in the past few minutes. Ma'am, I owe you an apology. I was completely wrong about you, and I'm sorry for the disrespectful way I've treated you. Sarah nodded graciously. Apology accepted, Staff Sergeant, but I want you to remember this lesson. Don't assume you know someone's capabilities or background based on their appearance or their cover story. Sometimes the most dangerous people are the ones who look the most ordinary. As Rodriguez left the training facility, clearly shaken by what he had learned, Kane approached Sarah with a mixture of admiration and concern. That was well handled, but now we have a security issue. Rodriguez isn't trained in operational security, and he might not be able to keep quiet about what he's learned. Sarah nodded. I know. But his intrusion forced the issue. Continuing to hide my identity from him would have been impossible after what he witnessed. Kane considered this for a moment. Maybe we can turn this to our advantage. Rodriguez has influence with the enlisted Marines on this base. If he starts treating you with the respect you deserve, others might follow his lead. That would certainly make the rest of my assignment easier, Sarah agreed. The prediction proved accurate. Within days, word had spread through the Marine units that there was more to the quiet physical therapist than anyone had realized. The exact details remained classified, but it was clear that Sarah Martinez had the respect and confidence of the Navy SEAL instructors, which carried significant weight with Marines who understood the elite status of special operations personnel. The change in how Sarah was treated on the base was dramatic. Marines who had previously dismissed her now sought her out for advice and treatment. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez went out of his way to be respectful and professional in all their interactions, and other Marines followed his example. But more importantly for Sarah's mission, her new status gave her access to information and perspectives that had been unavailable while she was maintaining her cover as just a physical therapist. Marines began talking to her openly about their training experiences, their concerns about program effectiveness, and their suggestions for improvements. Sarah was able to complete her evaluation of the Camp Pendleton training programs with a level of detail and insight that would have been impossible while maintaining complete operational security. Her final report to Commander Stevens included comprehensive assessments of training effectiveness, detailed recommendations for improvements, and specific suggestions for better integration of medical training with tactical skills development. The mission that had begun with Sarah being underestimated and dismissed by nearly everyone on the base had concluded with her being recognized as a respected professional whose expertise was valued by some of the most elite military personnel in the world. But perhaps the most important outcome of Sarah's time at Camp Pendleton wasn't the successful completion of her intelligence mission. It was the lesson that everyone who had interacted with her, from Master Chief Kane to Staff Sergeant Rodriguez to the dozens of Marines she had treated, would carry with them for the rest of their careers. The lesson that appearances can be deceiving, that assumptions about people's capabilities can be dangerously wrong, and that sometimes the most competent and dangerous people are the ones who look the most ordinary. Sarah Martinez had spent months being underestimated and taunted by people who thought they knew exactly who she was and what she was capable of. In the end, the revelation of her true identity and background had stunned everyone who had misjudged her and taught them all a lesson they would never forget.